Good morning, everyone. In the last class, we have started our discussion related to exception handling. What is exception? Exception is an unexpected and unwanted situation occurring in the application. In order to handle the exceptions in the Java, we have try, catch, throw, throws, finally keywords. But when it comes to REST API, we need to handle the exception and we need to convey that exception message to the client. In order to do that, we are going for exception handlers. How many ways we can create exception handlers? How many ways we can create exception handlers? Exception handlers we can create in two ways. One is controller based exception handling and the second one is global exception handling. So in the last session, we created controller based exception handling. Controller based exception handling nothing but if any exception occurs within that controller, then that handler is going to execute. It is also called as local exception handling. This exception handler is applicable only for one class. Now let me run this application, run as boot application. So here I have demo REST controller. I have welcome REST controller. I have demo REST controller and I have welcome REST controller. I have demo REST controller and I have welcome REST controller. So when we go to here, localhost colon 8080, localhost colon 8080. See, when I send a request for demo REST controller method, we are getting some exception. When we send the request to demo REST controller, we are getting some exception. When the exception occurred in the catch block, I am rethrowing that exception. I am logging the exception and I am rethrowing the exception. When I rethrow that exception in their class, handler is available. That handler is handling that exception. So how to write the handler for the exception? By using @exception handler value is equal to arithmetic exception. That means in this demo REST controller class, if we get arithmetic exception, then this method is going to handle that. In demo REST controller, if we get arithmetic exception, then that will be handled by this method. I have here another controller /welcome. If I send a request to localhost colon 8080 /welcome, then is it getting handled? Is that exception of the welcome REST controller is getting handled by our exception handler or it is not handling by the exception handler? Guys, is my exception handler executing? My exception handler not executing? Come on, respond. Exception handler is executing. Exception handler is not executing. Exception handler is not executing. Exception handler is not executing. What is the reason? Our exception handler is available within the controller. If our exception handler available within the controller, then it is called as controller based exception handling. It is also called as local exception handling. Can we say it as a local exception handling? Can we say that it is a local exception handling? Perfect. Now, instead of using this local exception handling, we can go for global exception handling. Let me go for global exception handler. Now, app exception handler. I'm going to create one class as a global exception handler class, new class. Here I'm creating app exception handler. I'm taking a class with a name called app exception handler. This exception handler class should be global. This exception handler should be global. What is the meaning of global? This exception handler should be global. What is the meaning of global? The global meaning in this application, wherever we get the exception, this handler should be able to handle that. For that, we will use REST controller advice. REST controller advice, not REST controller, REST controller advice. So whatever the handler we created within the controller, take out from there and keep it here. That's it. Okay. So instead of writing the handler within the controller, we are writing the handler outside of the controller. So if I write the handler within the controller, then that handler is applicable for only one controller. Now I am taking this handler logic from controller and I'm keeping inside the app exception handler, which is a global exception handler. That is called, that is my REST controller advice. So whenever you keep the handler within the REST controller advice, in the whole application, wherever you get the exception, that will be handled by this exception handler. Now see here, slash welcome is available here, slash demo is available. Slash demo is one method available in demo REST controller. Slash welcome is available. Slash welcome is one method available in welcome controller. So there are two classes available and two methods are available. Two different classes available, two different methods are available. All right, let us try to execute it. Run as boot application. I'm running the boot application now. I'm running the boot application now. I'm running the boot application now. Okay, let's try this. Slash welcome. Now, when I send a request to slash welcome, is it handling the exception? When I go for slash demo, is it handling the exception? When I send a request to slash demo, my exception handled. When I send the request to slash welcome, my exception is handled. So now with this, can I say we are able to implement global exception handling? With this, can we say that we are able to implement global exception handling? Come on, guys. So what is the difference between local exception handling and global exception handling? Guys, what is the difference between local exception handling and global exception handling? Come on. Global local means it is going to, if I write the handler method within the controller, then that will become local exception handling. If I write this handler in a separate class, then that will become global exception handling. Global exception handling means in the whole application, it is going to handle the exception. In this project, wherever in any class, if we get arithmetic exception, that will be handled by this handler method. In the whole application, wherever we get the arithmetic exception, this handler is going to execute. This is global exception handling. This is called global exception handling. Are you clear with my point? The difference between local exception handler and global exception handler? Are you clear with local exception handling and global exception handling? Yes, we are clear with local exception handling and global exception handling. So as per above code, exception handler will execute only for that controller. Local exception handling. To implement exception handling globally, we need to create a class like below. To implement global exception handling, we need to write a class like below. To implement a global exception handling, we need to write a class like below. So that will handle that will handle the exceptions in the entire application. To implement the global exception handling, we need to write a class like below. We need to write a class like below. Global exception handling. Are you clear with my point? Fine. Next one. Guys, in the real time, sometimes we are going to deal with user defined exceptions. In the real time, sometimes we are going to deal with user defined exceptions. How to deal with user defined exceptions? See here, how to deal with user defined exceptions. Now, how to create a user defined exception? First of all, class, I'm going to create an exception called no data found exception. So I want to create one user defined exception. How to create user defined exceptions in the Java? Class no data found exception extends runtime exception or exception anything. Extends runtime exception. Okay. For this, I will specify string message super of message. It is going to call superclass constructor. Right. So can I say that this is one user defined exception? Can I say this is one user defined exception? Yes or no? Can I say this is one user defined exception? Guys, come on. This is one user defined exception. Public class no data found exception extends runtime exception. In this class, I am writing parameterized constructor. In that constructor, I am using super message. That means super class constructor it is going to call. This is one exception. Perfect. I created one user defined exception. Let me create one more controller. Let me create one controller as book controller. I'm creating a class with a name called book controller. Let me write one method, public string get price. So in order to get the price of the book, I'm expecting string ISBN. ISBN, universal international book number will be for every book which is published into the market one, ISBN will be available. So I want to read that ISBN as a path variable. I want to read the ISBN as a path variable. Okay. So now I'm going to specify get mapping slash price slash ISBN slash price slash ISBN. That is the method parameter. All right. So I'm representing this class as a REST controller. For that, I'm using REST controller annotation. For this, I need to specify string message is equal to some value, and I am going to return that message. Are you clear with this method now? Are you clear with this method now? Guys, come on. Are you clear with this method now? Yes. Public class book controller. So this class I represented as a REST controller by using @REST controller annotation. Book controller is a class. I'm mapping this class as a REST controller. In this REST controller, I am writing a method. Public string get price is the method. Path variable ISBN. Okay. Now here I want to represent a condition. I want to write a condition. If ISBN dot equals to ISBN 001 message is equal to book price is $400. Else throw new no data found exception. No data found exception. Book not found. or else I will say invalid ISBN. I will say invalid ISBN. So can I say that I'm throwing one user defined exception now? Can you see that I'm throwing one user defined exception now? I created one user defined exception. I created one user defined exception with a name called no data found exception. See here, I created one exception, my own exception. I created my own exception. My own exception name is no data found exception. Public class no data found exception. Extending from runtime exception. Public class no data found exception extending from runtime exception. All right, fine. Here I am writing a book controller. In the book controller, if ISBN is equal to ISBN 001, then I'm saying book price is $400. ISBN is 001, then book price is $400. If ISBN not 001, then I'm throwing no data found exception. So no data found is a predefined exception. No data found is a user defined exception. No data found is a predefined exception. No data found is a user defined exception. Guys, no data found is a predefined exception. No data found is a user defined exception. Can you tell me now? No data found is a predefined exception or it is a user defined exception? It is a user defined exception. Perfect. Let's run this program. Run as boot application. Run as boot application. Run as boot application. Let us make a request. Localhost colon 8080/price/ISBN 001. If I give the correct ISBN, then I am getting the response. So if ISBN 001 book price is $400, I'm able to get the book price is $400. For example, if I give ISBN 003, then what happened? When I give ISBN 003, what happened? We are getting exception. We are throwing the exception. What is that exception? No data found exception. Is this the right way to say that, to show the exception to the client? Guys, is this the right way? Is this the right way to show the exception to the client? Is this the right way to show the exception to the client? Is this the right way to show the exception to the client? Now what is happening here? Now what is happening here? What is happening here? Whenever we send a request, whenever we send a request to the application is throwing some exception. Exception is displaying to the client directly. Exception is displaying to the client directly. Exception is displaying to the client directly. If we display the exception to the client directly, can he understand that exception? He cannot understand that exception. Can he understand that exception or he cannot understand that exception? Can he understand that exception or he cannot understand that exception? He cannot understand that exception. He cannot understand that exception. Are you getting my point? So then what we need to do we have the handler for user defined exception? Do we have any handler for this user defined exception or we don't have a handler for this user defined exception? Do we have handler for this exception or we don't have handler for this exception? Do we have a handler for this exception or we don't have handler for this exception? Do we have a handler for this exception or we don't have handler for this exception? We don't have a handler. So now, is it recommended to create the handler within the controller or outside the controller? Which one is recommended? Creating the handler within the controller, outside the controller? If I create the handler within the controller, then what is the problem? If I create the handler within the controller, what is the problem? If I create the handler within the controller, then what is the problem? It is applicable only for this class. So can I create that in the global handler? Can I create that handler in the global? Yes. Which exception we need to handle now? We need to handle no data found exception. Whenever a request comes to this REST API method, if ISBN is not available, it is rethrowing the exception as no data found exception. In the real-time projects, we are going to create the user-defined exceptions and we are going to handle user-defined exceptions. We are going to handle user-defined exceptions. Are you getting my point? Are you getting my point? User-defined exceptions. Perfect. Let us create the handler. Let us create the handler. Public response entity. I want to send the exception data, exception information I want to send to the client. We already created a binding class. Okay. So this is used to handle no data found exception. NDFE, no data found exception. This method I am using to handle no data found exception. Okay. Now, so we need to specify this method is used to handle which exception. Exception handler value is equal to no data found exception dot class. Okay. So here we are going to specify no data found exception NFE, NDFE, no data found exception. Now, why that exception is coming? We are going to get that exception message NDFE dot get message. For no data found exception, I will give the code as a 5. For that, I will give the code as a 5. Now I'm going to return something like this. So this is the method which is used to handle no data found exception in our application. This is the method which is used to handle no data found exception in our application. Are you clear with my point? Are you clear with my point? Are you clear with my point? Yes. So here we have a controller. Within the controller, based on some condition, I'm throwing custom exception. I mean to say user defined exception. So to handle this user defined exception, I am writing one method, exception handler. Okay. So this method I'm writing in the controller advice, REST controller advice. That means it is a global exception handler. That means it is a global exception handler. Are you clear? So this is a global exception handler. So which exception this method should handle? This method should handle no data found exception. At the rate exception handler value is equal to no data found exception. Now, whenever this handler got executed, I am creating some exception message to the client. Why we are getting the exception? Why we are getting the exception? That message I am preparing into binding class. That binding class I am setting as a response body and I am sending response to the client. Now, guys, it is an internal server error or it is a bad request given by the client. Status code. It should be internal server or it is a bad request. Come on. Internal server or bad request. Client has given invalid ID. So whenever we get a arithmetic exception, that means our code issue. That is a server side problem. When we get invalid ID, then it is not a internal server error. It is a bad request. So based on the situation, you need to decide that status code. Based on the situation, you need to decide that status code. Are you getting my point? Based on the situation, we need to decide that status code. Clear, guys? Clear for everyone? Is this clear for everyone? Perfect. Now send a request now. ISBN 003. So when I send a request ISBN 00, if I show you in the Postman, you will get more clarity. Chrome, Postman. Let me go to Postman. Let me go to Postman. Get request. If I give 001, send it. What we are getting? Status we are getting as a 200. Status we are getting as a 200. Price is $400. Status is 200. Price we are getting as $400. Are you clear with my point? Are you clear with my point? Status we are getting as a 200. Price we are getting as $400. If I give 003, now see, we are getting 400 bad request, message invalid ISBN, code AIT005, something like this. So is this looking correctly? Can client understand what is the problem? Why he is getting error response? Can client understand why he is getting the error response? Guys, can client understand easily why he is getting error response? Yes or no? We are displaying what is the reason, and we are setting status code also. With this, clients can easily understand why they are getting exception in our application. So in the real-time project also, we will handle exceptions like this. Based on the situation, we will throw user-defined exceptions. Those user-defined exceptions we will handle in the handlers. We'll handle in the handlers. Working with user-defined exceptions. Working with user-defined exceptions. Working with user-defined exceptions. Create user-defined exception class. Create user-defined exception class like below. I have created one user-defined exception class. The class name is no data found exception. Create user-defined exception class, that is no data found exception. Okay. Create a REST controller. Create a REST controller. Create a REST controller. Create a REST controller method and throw the exception. Throw the exception based on condition. So this is my REST controller, that is book controller. If ISBN is 001, it is returning the message. If ISBN is not 001, it is throwing the exception. Okay, I am throwing user defined exception, that is no data found exception. I'm throwing user defined exception, that is no data found exception. Create exception handler method. Create exception handler method, global method, not local. I'm creating global method. Okay, so this is our REST controller advice. In the REST controller advice, I'm creating this global method. I'm creating global method. Okay, now whenever exception occurs, Now, whenever exception occurs, then this global handler is going to handle that exception. So with this, do you know how to handle exceptions in our applications? With this, do you know how to handle exceptions in our applications? How people will handle the exceptions in the real time? How people will handle exceptions in the real time? Do you have this clarity now? Do you have this clarity now? Guys, come on. Predefined exceptions and user defined exceptions. So I created one user defined exception. This user defined exception I created by extending from runtime exception. This user defined exception I created by using a runtime exception. Book controller. Book controller means a normal REST controller I created. In the REST controller, I have created one method. Method is binded to get mapping. Method is binded to get mapping slash price slash ISBN. If ISBN is 001, I am returning the message. If ISBN is not 001, I'm throwing the user defined exception I have created. This is a constructor. I'm throwing the exception by creating object for the user defined exception. So whenever the no data found exception occurred in the project, to handle that exception, I have exception handler. This exception handler method I have written inside REST controller advice. I specified exception handler value is equal to no data found exception. That means this method is responsible to handle no data found exception. So in this method, I am creating a binding object. I'm setting the data, why this exception occurred. What is the reason of this exception? What is the root cause of the exception I am setting here? What is the root cause of the exception I'm setting here? Exception is equal to new exception info. It is a binding class. It is a binding class. For this binding class, I'm setting the data. For this binding class, I'm setting the data. And I'm returning response entity with this exception data in the response body status code bad request. Earlier, for arithmetic exception, I'm setting the status code as internal server error. For no data found exception, I'm setting the status code as a bad request because the reason it is invalid ID. Client has given the invalid ID. It is a bad request. Here, arithmetic exception, that means our code issue. For that, we are giving internal server error. For that, we are giving internal server error. Are you clear with my point? Are you clear with my point? Are you clear with my point, guys? Perfect. Perfect. Good, guys. So with this, we completed our discussion related to exception handling in the REST API. We are able to handle predefined exceptions like arithmetic exceptions, null pointer exceptions. We can handle like this. Just you need to specify value is equal to which exception you want to handle. Specify that exception name. Sometimes in the project, we need to deal with custom exceptions. So create a custom exception, throw the custom exception based on the situation, then write the handler method also for that custom exception. Are you clear? Are you clear? Perfect. Next, the most important concept, Spring security. How to secure our applications. What is the next topic, guys? How to secure our applications. Good. Guys, I will cover this in the class also. I will explain how to secure our applications. At the same time, I have conducted security workshop also. If you want to go with these videos, Spring security workshop I conducted, 3 videos I have, 3 classes I have taken for Spring security. Let me show you. Yeah. Spring Boot security. First video, total 3 videos I have taken, 1.5 hour, 2 hours, 1 hour 15 minutes, 2, 3, 4, almost 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 5 hours I have explained on Spring security. What is the Spring security and why we need to go for Spring security? How to go for Spring security? I have explained in 5 videos. 5 videos. What is security? Theoretically, what is the security? How to implement security in our applications? I have explained. I have explained here. Okay. So before going to implement this Spring security, can you go with this theoretical part of security? Can you go with theoretical part of Spring security? Theoretically, can you read this security so that we can implement that practically in our class? JWT also I have explained here. JWT token also I have explained here. Can you guys go through at least first video before coming to tomorrow session? Can you guys go through first video before coming to tomorrow session? Okay, fine. Meanwhile, I will show you a simple REST API with the security. First of all, guys, in order to implement security, to implement security for our applications, to implement security for our applications, Spring provided security concept, security module. To implement a security for our applications, Spring provided security module. To use Spring security in our project, to use Spring, to use Spring security in our project. To use Spring security in our project, Spring security starter we need to add. Spring security starter we need to add in pom.xml file. Okay, let me create one simple REST API with the security. What will happen? Spring starter project, Spring starter project 57, Spring Boot microservice security app. This security is a basic security, guys. Whatever the security I'm adding here, that is a basic security. Spring Web Lombok, we need to add the dependency, that is Spring security dependency. Click on next, click on finish. I have created one simple project with web starter. Along with the web starter, I have selected security starter also. Along with the web starter, I have created a project with a security starter. Just I have added the starter. That's it. I have not done anything. I have not done anything. I have just added security starter. Spring Boot project I created. When I am creating this Spring Boot project, I have selected one dependency, that is security dependency. Spring Boot starter security dependency I have added, and I have added web starter. I have added web starter. In this project, let me create one simple REST controller. New class, new class REST. Simple welcome REST controller I'm creating. Click on finish. Click on finish. So to represent this class as a REST controller, we will use @REST controller annotation. So to represent this class as a REST controller, we are using @REST controller annotation. Now, public string welcome. Nothing. I'm just writing one simple method. That's it. I'm just writing one simple method, which is get mapping. That's it. Here, I'm taking string message is equal to welcome to Ashok IT. Return that message. Get mapping slash welcome message. I'm returning that message. Did I implement anything related to security in this project, guys? Did I implement anything related to security in this project? Did I implement anything related to security in this project? No, no. What we have done, we created one project. In that project, we have added security starter. We created one project. In that project, we have added security starter. That's it. Just a dependency added. Then I created one REST controller. In the REST controller, we are having one method binded to get request. That's it. Update our project. Refresh Maven. Update the project. Force update. Update the project. Force update. Right click. Run as boot app. Right click. Run as boot app. Okay. This application is getting started. Observe the console. When the application is started, can you see one password generated? Guys, whenever we run our application, can you see one password generated? That is Spring Security password. So whenever you add security dependency, by default, one password got generated. Who is generating that password? Did I ask the Spring to generate the password? Spring generated that password by default. Did I ask the Spring to generate that password, or it generated that password by default? It generated that password by default. It generated that password by default. Okay, now let's go here and access our application. Localhost colon 8080. Am I able to access my application? Earlier, we used it to access the REST API method directly, but is it allowing me to access the application? Is it allowing me to access the application? No. Why it is not allowing me? By default, this REST controller got secured by Spring Security. Whenever we add this Spring Security dependency, by default, it is going to secure all the endpoints of our application. Slash welcome is one endpoint. Slash is the URL pattern. Slash is the URL pattern. I have created one project. In that project, just I have added security dependency. So when I try to access that method, it is asking me to log in. So if it is asking you to log in to access the application, that means it is performing authentication. It is verifying Are you the right user to access this application or not? It is asking username and password. The username by default will be admin. The default username will be admin. The default password which printed on the console. The default password which got printed on the console. Copy this password. Copy this password. Paste here. Sign in. Sign in. Bad credentials. Why bad credentials? Admin using generated security password. Admin password. Sign in. Bad credentials. Instead of admin, let's try with user password sign in. Yes. So the default username is user and password is printed on the console. The default username is user and it got printed on the console. So when you add just a security dependency to implement security for our applications, Spring provided one security module. To use Spring security in our project, security starter we need to add in pom.xml. So what is the dependency we have? Spring Boot starter security dependency we have. If we add this dependency in the pom.xml, by default it is going to secure all the methods of our application, all the endpoints of our application. It is going to secure all the endpoints of our application. All right. So by default, it is considering default when we add, it will secure. By default, it will secure. By default, it will secure all the endpoints of our application. Default username, default username will be user. Default password will be printed on the console. Will be printed on the console. Okay, sir, I am not interested to go with this default username and password. I'm not interested to go with the default username and password. We can set that. We can set the username and password also to protect our application. Spring dot security dot user dot name. I'm giving the username as admin. Spring dot security dot user dot password admin @ 123. So if you don't want to use the default credentials of to secure your application, you can specify the username and password to secure your application using properties. Okay, now let's update this project. Refresh, right click, run as boot application. Now our application is running. Our application is running. Now localhost colon 8080. Now again it is asking to log in. What is the username? Admin. What is the password? Admin @ 123. Now see, I'm able to get the message welcome to Ashok IT. So can we configure our own credentials also? Can we configure our own credentials also to secure our application? So where we can configure our own credentials to secure our application within the properties file. Okay, sir, if you are accessing from the browser, it is asking for credentials. How can we access this application from the Postman? How can we access this application from the Postman? Or how can we access this REST API from the client application? Now go to Postman. Go to Postman. Okay. So now Postman is available. Get request localhost colon 8080. Localhost colon 8080 send. When I send a request, what is the response I'm getting? Empty response. What it is showing me? Unauthorized. Am I able to access this or I'm unable to access this? Am I able to from the browser if I access? It is showing me login page. When I access this application from the browser, it is showing me a login page. I logged in with the credentials. Credentials I configured in the properties file only. Perfect. Now I am trying to access the API from the Postman. When I try to access from the Postman, is it allowing me or it is not allowing me? It is not allowing me. What is the status code I'm getting? Unauthorized. What is the status code I'm getting? Unauthorized. That means that means I am not giving the credentials to access. Now I need to send the credentials in the request to access the API. Type authorization, type basic auth, username. What is our username? Admin. What is the password? Admin at the rate 123. Okay, now I am giving type as a basic auth, username as admin, password as admin at the rate 123, update the request. When I update the request, you see headers added, authorization header added, basic, that username and password is encoded. Click on send. Now I got the response. Okay, so when you want to access the REST API, which is secured, you need to add the credentials in the authentication by using HTTP header. By using HTTP header, then only it is going to allow you to process, then only it is going to allow you to access the request. Then only it is going to allow you to access the request. Are you guys getting my point? Now my REST API is secured. How I am accessing my REST API? Here I'm setting authorization type as a basic authentication, username of the REST API, password of the REST API, update the request. When I update the request, what happened? That request data updated, the header got added. What is the header data? Authorization, basic space, the encoded username and password will be available. If I don't set this authorization header, if I remove it, now what is it is adding by default because it is available here. Send it. Now the header is getting added. After removing, I have removed this. When I removed these things, now it is not going to accept that request what we are going to send. So whenever we add that Spring Security Starter, by default it will take the username as user, password will be generated on the console. So to override the default credentials, to override default credentials, we can configure credentials in application.properties file. In application.properties file like this. In order to override default credentials, we can configure the credentials in the application.properties file like this. Okay, can I give you an assignment for you today? Can I give an assignment for today? Guys, can you do the assignment? Assignment. Develop a REST API with the Spring Security. Develop a REST API with Spring Security. With the Spring Security dependency. Configure credentials in application.properties file. Now develop REST client and access the REST API. Develop REST client and access the REST API using REST template or web client. Using REST template or web client. So what I mean to say is, you guys need to create one REST API. You guys need to create one REST API and you need to create one REST client. Two projects. So this is our REST API. This is our REST API and this is our REST client. This REST client should send a request to the REST API and this REST API should respond to the REST client. Request and response. So this REST API is a normal REST API. That REST API is a secured REST API. The REST API is a normal REST API. That REST API is a secured REST API. REST API secured. What security? Basic auth. What security we are using? Basic authentication. HTTP basic auth is the security we are using to secure our REST API. This REST API you need to develop, and that REST API should be secured with the basic authentication. Secured with the basic authentication. How to implement basic authentication? We have done the basic authentication only. Just we have added security dependency and we have added the credentials and we created one REST controller method. So that means we have added basic authentication for the REST API. So that REST API which is having a basic authentication, we are able to access from the browser, we are able to access from the postman. But now I want you people to access that secured REST API by developing a client application. So tomorrow we want to access a REST API of other company. That REST API is secured. That REST API is secured. So how can I access the REST API from my client application? You understand my requirement? You understand the assignment for today? All of you. You understood the assignment for today. So basically, you need to develop one REST API with security, basic security. That is called a HTTP basic authentication. So credentials will be available. By default, it will generate the credentials. Default username is user. Password will be printed on the console. If you want to override the default credentials, then you can configure the credentials in the properties file. Okay. Now REST API is completed. It is secured. Try to develop a client application and access the REST API. REST API is secured. We need to send a request to the REST API which is having the basic authentication. REST client program we need to develop. Can you try this? Can you try this? How to develop a REST client to access? How to develop REST client to access secured REST APIs? How to develop REST client to access secured REST API? Clear? Now, good guys, fine. So I will give that security videos also along with the notes. Please go through those videos and complete the assignment. So tomorrow we will discuss about security topic only. Tomorrow we are going to implement Spring security applications. Thank you guys. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll continue in the tomorrow session. Bye bye. Have a great day.